Mexico is where it's at, and it's going to be where it's at for the next several decades for sure. And we have a legal structure in the United States for cutting out the United States from global energy flows in order to keep our surplus production locked up at home. So if we ever do get into an energy crisis, and I think we're going to see this next year, we'll have the Biden administration closing the door on exports, which will supersaturate our market. And there's a lot of details that need to be worked out. There's especially in the American Northeast, which imports its fuels. But overall, you supersaturate the American market, you'll have energy prices going down here as they go up everywhere else. And remember that Saudi Arabia and Iran, that tiff, that's just kind of the first one. If you've got flows going out from the Persian Gulf, I would argue that the country that we need to get into the mindset of being the most disruptive in terms of energy trade is India.
India.
Yeah, they're the first major stop out of the Persian Gulf. Every drop of crude that flows to China goes by Indian coast, and India is a real country with a real navy and a real air force, and it would be child's play for them to capture every single Chinese tanker. And you want to talk about something that would destroy the Chinese nation in a matter of months, that would do it. I think actually today, so December 13th, the Chinese suspended the app that monitored everybody's movement, which was something that a lot of people who were concerned about privacy and national control thought would never happen, regardless of what happened with COVID. So at least to a degree, the Chinese have been concerned about health. The problem is by demonizing vaccines that came from outside of the country, they were left with the ones they made themselves, and the ones that they made themselves we now know broadly don't work. Countries like Indonesia, the UAE, Chile, they used the Chinese vaccines in their first round, and when they discovered that it barely worked against the original strain and was useless against Alpha, Delta, and Omicron, they discontinued the Chinese vaccines completely. But the Chinese, having spent 2 years talking about how the American vaccines will make you infertile and magnetic, can't go out and push those on their own people. So the Chinese population is broadly, well, they're vaccinated, but they're not vaccinated with something that works. Yeah, it's like if you understand the baseline and the baseline never moves, command economy is okay. But yes, in a more dynamic situation, sure, you can make decisions more quickly, but it also means if you make the wrong decision, it's a disaster. And they've made several wrong decisions. We're conflating a couple issues here. They're very real, but they're not interconnected. So let's start with the population issue. When countries urbanize, they have fewer kids. Well, China didn't really begin their urbanization program until 1980, which is about the same time that the one-child policy kicked in. So you got the world's most constrictive population growth policy in it at the same time you started the world's most rapid urbanization process. And so the birth rate today in Beijing and Shanghai is the lowest of any urban centers in world history, less than 0.8 children per woman.
Wow.
And it's been so low for so long that there are no longer enough Chinese under age 40 to have enough children to generate a new generation. So they've already changed the one-child policy to 2 childs to 3-child, and now it's largely actually abolished. But it was too late, and there are not enough people who could have the kids. And of the people who want kids, they're all living in condos, so there's no space to have a kid. So basically, China concentrated 10 generations of economic development and urbanization into 40 years. And it's over. You can only do that once. And there's now no longer enough people to have a next generation. So on the demographic numbers alone, China will be gone by 2030. That assumes nothing else goes wrong. The Ukraine war is crisis, and China is the last country in line, so they suck up most of that. China imports 80% of the stuff they need to grow their food, so you have a disruption in agricultural markets or phosphate markets or potash markets. China sucks up the entirety of that. China is dependent upon access to other countries to sell its goods because it no longer has enough young people to buy them itself. So if the Americans decide to close the trade doors, that destroys China too. Everything that has worked well for the world for the last 75 years has benefited China. But none of it has been because of something China did. China was just fortunate to develop in that specific environment. And now it's ended. I think there was an understanding when Xi came in 10 years ago of just how deep the problem was. And excuse me. I also think there was an understanding of how little China could do to address any of this, because you basically would have to crawl on the floor on your stomach to the Americans' feet and beg for dispensation. I mean, the scale of support that China would need from the rest of the world in order to continue its growth is immense. And the whole idea of the Chinese rise is that the Americans will, for some reason, pay for it all. Well, that was always kind of a reach. For a number of countries, that is going to be seen as a viable option, but it's not one for China. Because if they go to the southwest, they hit the Himalayas and they stop. If they go south, they hit Vietnam jungle mountains. And the last time the Chinese tried to go into Vietnam in 79, they were treated to the same warm welcome that the Americans were.
The Vietnamese don't mess around. Yeah.
Yeah, they can't go out. They hit the first island chain, and they don't have the naval power to punch through it. If they go north, the Russians have been very clear, going back to Yeltsin, that we won't meet you with men in tanks. We're just going to nuke you. There's nowhere to go.
God.
And their problem ultimately isn't really about resources. It's about population and market access. When the Ukraine war started and the sanctions kicked in, especially the financial sanctions, and the Russians lost all their euro, gold, and dollars that were stationed abroad, they then bought nearly $500 billion of yuan assets and were like thumbing their nose to the United States. See, we got other options. And then the day came that they needed to cash in some of those yuan assets to do things. And the Chinese like, no, that's all right. We don't want them back. And the Chinese discovered that they just lost $500 billion. So the Russians are just quietly now going back to euros and dollars on the black market because it's more reliable than dealing with the Chinese.
Yeah.
Let me start by saying that this war is nowhere near over.
It's not.
The Russians have not fully mobilized. The first phases of the war, they only had 100,000 troops in theater. They have 8 million men aged 20 to 30 that can potentially be drafted. They have only to this point drafted about 300,000. And I expect by the time we get to May's kind of the date to watch, because they have a mud season in Ukraine, which will be March and April, or just finished October and November, when the trees are pretty much bare. The ground has not frozen solid and it's just murky. And you can't really do a lot of mobilized warfare in that sort of environment. Every time we get a new client, we have to learn the world from their point of view.
Okay.
So if I have a client that grows soy in North Dakota, I have to learn the global soy market. And that takes me into Brazil, the geography and the finance of Brazilian development and what's going on in Ukraine and the third largest soy market. And then I go into finance, and then I go into manufacturing, then I go into transport. I've given probably about 800 presentations since I started doing this about 10 years ago. And then for the 12 years before that,